All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a pretty intense text that's been making the rounds online. It's called the Blackpill Bible, and what it tries to do is explain the modern dating world, but specifically from the perspective of men who feel like the game is fundamentally rigged against them. So the entire argument of this text really hinges on one core idea, something the author calls the dating hierarchy of needs. Now, you can think of it like Maslow's pyramid, with the basic needs at the bottom, but this one's for dating. And right there at the very foundation, the most basic need is the question, am I getting any interest from the opposite sex at all? The text claims that while many women start higher up thinking about real compatibility, a whopping 90% of men are basically stuck on level 1.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this worldview, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with why the author sees dating as a rigged game, then look at their idea of a monopolized market. After that, we'll talk about looks as the so-called new currency, this idea of the replaceability factor, and we'll finish up with the author's 3 proposed keys to success.
All right, first up, a rigged game. The whole premise here, according to the source, is that men and women are not just playing the same game with different strategies. They're playing on completely different fields.
And this quote, it really gets to the heart of what the author is trying to say. They're arguing that when women talk about dating problems, it's about finding the right person. Things like compatibility, goals, connection. But, they claim, when most men talk about dating problems, it's way more basic. It just boils down to the struggle of getting any attention in the first place.
So, why the huge difference? Well, according to the author, it all comes down to what they call a monopolized market. The idea here is that a very, very small group of men have cornered all the romantic options. And this is the data they point to as their key piece of evidence. Take a look at this. Among young adults, you've got 63% of men reporting they're single, compared to just 34% of women. That's nearly double. Now, the author doesn't think this is just because women are dating older guys. No. Their theory is that a small handful of top-tier men are dating multiple women at once, basically monopolizing the entire market. Okay, now this next part is pretty intense. The author uses this really stark analogy from commercial chicken farming, of all things, to explain their theory. They create this hierarchy. You've got the select males, who are valued for breeding, you've got the females, valued for laying eggs, and then you have the non-select males, who are considered useless and are disposed of. It's a brutal metaphor, for sure, but it's how they hammer home their point about how they believe society assigns value.
Let's move on to the second big pillar of this argument. The author claims that in our modern online world, one thing has become king, a new currency, especially for men, and that's looks.
The text uses data like this from the dating site OkCupid to make its case. According to this data they cite, women on the platform rated only the top 5% of male profiles as above average in attractiveness. And that, of course, leaves the other 95% in an incredibly crowded and competitive field.
So, what does a situation like that lead to? Well, the author says it creates 2 totally different game plans. For most guys, it becomes a numbers game, a hit and hope strategy. You just swipe right on almost everyone and hope for a match. But for women, who might be getting way more incoming interest, it's the total opposite. It becomes swinging for the fence, being super selective and only aiming for those perceived top-tier profiles. And here's the thing, the author argues this change has happened incredibly fast. They use that classic boiling frog analogy to make the point. The idea is that the shift towards a looks-first market has happened so rapidly that society hasn't really caught up. Most people, in their view, didn't even notice the water getting hotter until it was already too late. Okay, so let's say a guy beats the odds and actually gets into a relationship. Is it smooth sailing from there? Not according to the author. This brings us to the next challenge, what the text calls the male replaceability factor.
The core argument here is not the imbalance of options doesn't just stop once you're in a relationship. The source claims that women in relationships are still getting attention, still getting offers from other men, but men in relationships, generally, not so much. And according to the author, this constant stream of new interest creates what feels like a pipeline of backup options for her, which can lead to a false sense that her current partner is more easily replaceable than he really is.
So after painting this pretty bleak picture of the dating world, the author does pivot. They don't just leave you with the problems. They switch from diagnosis to prescription. They argue there are 3 specific keys for a man to successfully navigate this whole thing.
So what are these keys? Well, it's a very pragmatic 3-step approach. Step 1 is looks, basically doing everything within your power to maximize your physical appearance, whatever your genetic starting point is. Step 2 is social skills, which the text defines as learning how to interact in a way that's normal and non-offensive. And then there's step 3, which the author says is the absolute most critical one. Exposure. You have to systematically put yourself out there.
And they get pretty specific about what exposure actually means, breaking it down into 3 distinct methods. First, you've got life exposure, just meeting people naturally through work, hobbies, daily life. It's passive, which is great, but it's hard to scale up. Then there's cold approach, literally walking up to strangers. This is highly scalable, but man, it takes a lot of time and a thick skin. And finally, there's online dating. You can do it from your couch, but as we've discussed, the competition is absolutely fierce and it's heavily weighted towards looks.
So in the end, what this text really does is it presents dating as a game that in the author's view is rigged, but a game that has rules. And if you know the rules, you can play. It lays out a very clear, systematic way to do just that. Which leaves us with a final, really interesting question to think about. What happens to our dating culture? What happens to all of us when more and more people start to believe these are the rules and actually start to play by them?